May the words of my mouth and the thoughts of all of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I say to you that listen. That's how Jesus begins our gospel lesson this morning. But that doesn't quite get what Jesus is saying. It might be better if we heard it as, I say to you that are still listening. Or, as a more colorful translation puts it, listen up. I've got something to tell you, people. The way Jesus starts this part of his sermon strongly suggests that some people who first heard it had stopped listening. Because there's no break from last week's gospel lesson to this one. Jesus proclaims the blessings and woes and just keeps going. This isn't a different sermon on a different day. It's just more of the same. But considering everything we heard last week about how the poor are blessed and the rich will be sent away empty, it's easy to understand why some people may have stopped listening. Jesus is challenging everything we think we know about how the world works. And he's not done yet. Jesus is proclaiming a new reality, God's reality. And in God's reality, everything is turned upside down. Enemies, the people we are supposed to hate, are actually the people we are supposed to love. It's a hard word, beloved. It seems impossible. So it's no wonder that Jesus is speaking to those who are still listening. But there's another reason why Jesus might wonder if we are still listening when he starts preaching about loving our enemies. And it has to do with a quirk in how we read the Bible in church. The Episcopal Church, like lots of other Christian denominations, uses something called a lectionary. In fact, here it is. A lectionary is a schedule. It tells us what parts of the Bible we read on any given Sunday. So when Jill lovingly makes the bulletins, it's online, but you open to the page, it tells you what texts we're going to read. That's, for instance, why we read the story of Jesus' birth at Christmas, his resurrection at Easter. And as an aside, when your clergy preach, we do not get to choose the texts for Sunday. They are given to us in this schedule. But the schedule doesn't always stay the same. And in some years, we don't actually have the chance to read all the parts of the Bible that are on the schedule. Now, this gets a little complicated. I love this stuff. So if you really want to know, talk to me afterward. But the one thing you really need to know is this. Excuse me. The parts of the Bible where Jesus tells us to love our enemies, they get skipped all the time. In fact, from 2001 to 2011, those parts of the Bible never got read on Sunday morning. For almost a whole decade, lots of Christians never heard Jesus tell us to love our enemies. Let that sink in just a moment. It's hard to believe that we went 10 years, particularly 10 years after 9/11, without hearing Jesus tell us to love our enemies. And yet it isn't that hard to believe because it's just hard. I don't want to love my enemies. I imagine you don't want to either. And I especially don't want to love my enemies when I feel under attack. But that's pretty much the exact situation of the people who heard Jesus say this for the first time. The crowds who came from all over to listen to Jesus, they are under Roman occupation. Their lives are basically constantly under attack. They don't have to look far to find their enemies. They simply lived each day knowing they would eventually be the victims of violence and economic exploitation. Just look at the examples that Jesus gives. When someone strikes you on the cheek, the people in charge are going to hurt you because they can. When someone takes away your coat, the people in charge will take everything that you have because they can. These are just the facts of life when you have enemies, and those enemies are powerful. One of my friends says it like this: it's one thing to love enemies when they hold no terror over us, when they are no more a threat to our beliefs or our ideologies. It is another thing to bless and not curse those whose intent is to cause destruction. What could Jesus possibly mean by directing these words to the poorest and the most vulnerable people in the ancient world? To answer that question, beloved, it might help us to understand what Jesus doesn't mean when he calls us to love our enemies. And there are at least two things that Jesus doesn't mean when he tells us that. And the first is this: loving our enemies doesn't mean we just give up and give in. If the poor and the hungry and the persecuted are truly blessed, then loving our enemies doesn't mean we simply let them do whatever they want. We don't just lie down and take it. The examples that Jesus gives, turning the other cheek, giving away both coat and shirt, these aren't passive. Jesus calls us to take some kind of action in the face of oppression. And the second thing Jesus doesn't mean is this: loving our enemies doesn't mean that we just become our enemies. Far from it. Jesus forbids his followers from responding to evil with evil and to answer violence with violence. We are called to do good in the face of oppression. So if loving our enemies doesn't mean we just give up and become victims, and it doesn't mean we just give in and become the same as those who hurt us, what does it mean? Hear this good news, beloved. Jesus offers us a third way. We love our enemies by refusing to accept the way that the world works. We love our enemies by doing what we talked about last week. We choose to embrace another reality, God's reality. Jesus calls us to reject the systems and structures of this world that make us believe that violence and oppression are just the facts of life. Each time we choose to love our enemies each time we turn the other cheek, we are tearing down the old way of doing things and making space for God to do something new in us and through us, and occasionally in spite of us. When we choose to love our enemies, we declare with our bodies sometimes with our common life, that there is another way, another reality, another world that is not governed by tit-for-tat violence and doesn't take for granted the fact that some people will always have power and use it badly. When we choose to love our enemies, we put our trust in God's reality and proclaim that that is what really matters. That is what is real. Now, some of you may be thinking, that all sounds good, maybe nonsensical, but good. But practically, what am I supposed to do about my enemies? And I would say a few things. The first is that answering that question takes time. More time than I have this morning. It also takes a community, this community, that helps us learn what it means to love our enemies. And sometimes that means knowing that we go to church with our enemies. Or perhaps, as someone told me once, you may be married to your enemy occasionally. So it takes time, it takes a community, but I do want to leave you with two things to consider. And the first is this. Make sure that you are in the right place to love your enemies. And this is what I mean. If thinking about enemies is hard for you, especially if you've experienced abuse or trauma or significant harm at the hands of another person, your first task is to love yourself, to let God love you, and to let this community love you. So if this talk about loving enemies has brought something deeply painful to mind, and you need some additional help, let me know. You don't have to do it by yourself. In your clergy and Nan, we have people we can refer you to who may be able to help you do the work of finding some healing in those kinds of situations. So if that is you, that's your invitation this morning. Love yourself well, so that one day you may be able to love your enemies. And the second is this. You can start by praying for your enemies, just like Jesus told us to. I always find it funny that in our prayers of the people, the ones that are given to us in the prayer book, although we can write our own, and we will in the coming months, we never mention our enemies. We mention lots of people, but we don't mention our enemies. I offer that to you for what it's worth. But here's one way that you might pray for them. It is a way that works decently for me. Imagine the people in your life who are doing harm to someone. To you, to someone you care about, to this planet that you love. And if you can, maybe even bring their face to mind, or say their name out loud. And then imagine bringing them into God's presence. Imagine them in God's reality. And just leave them there. Let this be so. Amen.